So welcome everyone, very pleased to be invited to chair today's debate. Very interested to see what the speakers have to say. Just to set the scene before I introduce you to our speakers, I suspect most of you, like me, weren't really aware of food banks until the last 2 or 3 years or so, whereas they now seem ubiquitous in almost any discussion about contemporary British society. I wasn't surprised that there was charitable donations given to those in need. There always have been, but I think the kind of rise of food banks has been a bit of a phenomenon, hence the debate today. Seems to me also that the term food banks become a kind of shorthand for a much broader discussion, as I say, about the state of British society, perhaps about the failings of capitalism more broadly, of contemporary government cuts, and an often discussed and used term of broken Britain, things aren't working, and food banks are an example of that. I have a particularly nerdy passion, it's gone now, in the Scottish independence referendum. And for any of you that were following that, you'll know that the term food banks and broken Britain were used as shorthand, really to say this is what Westminster represents and this is what we potentially represent in an independent Scotland. So very, very powerful term, food banks, when linked to the idea of broken Britain. But there has been a very real rise in the number and use of food banks. The Trussell Trust say they had 2 food banks, just 2, in 2004. And here we are a decade later, and they say they have 400 or more food banks. Not quite sure the number, but there's 400 plus. So is it really the case that families today are going hungry in the way they weren't 10 years ago? Is there really a greater demand for their services from people? Or some suggest, quite controversially, is the take-up of food bank services simply a reflection of increased supply and therefore people are using that supply? It doesn't reflect an increase in poverty or malnutrition or hunger. It's there and people do what's best for them and they make use of that service. But also I think there are broader discussions. What role do food banks serve today in relation to the broader welfare state? Should we approve of a shift to voluntary charity giving over centralised welfare state? Or perhaps do food banks represent a shift of responsibility for care and welfare from the state to the local community? And what does that mean more widely? Those are just some of the issues that may be looked at tonight by our speakers. I haven't seen their speeches, so I'm not sure. But those are some of the key issues that come up in the discussion of food banks. And hopefully there will be many more strands to pursue as well. So enough from me. That's just to set the scene for the debate. Let's meet our guest speakers tonight, who are very neatly sat in the order in which they're going to speak without me asking them to. So thank you. So on my far left here is Dave Clements. Dave is a public servant with over a decade's experience working in strategic management, project and communications roles in local government. He convenes the Institute of Ideas Social Policy Forum and is also author of Social Care for Free Citizens and co-editor of The Future of Community, Reports of a Death Greatly Exaggerated. And some of you may know Dave as a regular blogger for the Huffington Post and has written on food banks for them as well. So welcome to Dave. Next to me, very pleased to introduce Danks. Having begun her career teaching in some challenging secondary schools, Anne is now the Northern England Food Bank Network Manager for the Trussell Trust, the UK's largest provider of food banks. She's also partway through an MA in Justice, providing her with an opportunity, she says, to rigorously examine and dismantle common assumptions about poverty and its causes. So welcome to Anne. And last but by no means least, we have Richard Bridge. After working in the private sector as a finance director and an outreach advisor for the Citizens Advice Bureau, Richard currently supervises the Children's Centre Advice Project for Better Leeds Communities. He's also recently graduated in social policy from the University of Leeds and is author of the report, The Institutionalisation of Emergency Food Provision, a Danger to the Social Safety Net. So welcome to Richard. So how this is going to work is each of our guest speakers tonight is going to speak for a maximum of 8 minutes, starting with Dave. At the end of that, we'll allow them to respond to each other's points, and if they're quiet, and I don't expect them to be, then I'll try and promote some debate between the speakers, but then we'll come out to you, the audience, for your points and comments and ideas. So that's how it's going to work. So without further ado, Dave, why don't you kick us off?
I will. Okay, can you all hear me at the back? Yes? Good. Okay, so hunger in the UK. There's a question mark at the end of the title for a good reason. I don't believe there is hunger in the UK today. But I do think there's a phenomenon with food banks that needs to be explained, as Justine said. Going back, say, 3 or 4 years, there were tens of thousands of of people using food banks, vouchers issued to people to use food banks. In the past 2 to 3 years, that's increased to hundreds of thousands of people using food banks. A lot of the figures that I will rely on are going to refer back to the Trussell Trust because they're particularly good at producing stats. And as Justine said, they have a lot of food banks. I think they account for about a third of the country's 1,000+ food banks. So there's been a massive increase. Last year, the Trussell Trust alone had 900,000 plus vouchers issued to people to take up food at various food banks around the country. Now that has been used to suggest that over 1 million people are going hungry because they represent a third of the number of food banks across the country. Now, I think that's worth looking at. But first of all, I'd say from the beginning that I don't believe people are going hungry, but I do believe that a lot of people are hard up. I don't think that's particularly controversial statements. People are worse off now than they were a few years ago for a number of reasons. Looking back at the Trussell Trust figures, they say that something like a third of the people who are using food banks in their Trussell Trust network are using them because of low income, because of loss of a job, because they've lost their home, or because they've got into debt. So those are kind of people who are struggling financially for one reason or another. Of course, there are also global trends. There's rising prices for a whole host of reasons. Food, energy prices, these things are a problem for people. At the same time, wages are falling. That's got a lot more to do with the lack of representation of working people in the working place, you might say. There's a number of reasons, but the general trend is that prices have been rising, wages have fallen, or have at least stayed the same. The other explanation for the rise of food banks that's often ventured is around the welfare state. There seems to be a consensus, with the exception of the government, that various changes to the welfare state in recent times are responsible for some of that rise in the number of food banks. So, going back to the Trussell Trust, they say that 17% of the vouchers they issue are a consequence of recent welfare reforms. So, we have the bedroom tax. For those of you who don't know about the bedroom tax, it's essentially the removal of a subsidy for people who had spare rooms and were living in public housing. There's a dispute in most cases about whether those rooms are truly spare. A lot of disabled people are often using those spare rooms for equipment, and there have been a number of cases that have been won and lost in relation to that. Also, the bedroom tax has actually created more problems than it's solved because people on housing benefits have actually had to move into private accommodation because of this tax, and as a consequence their rents have gone up in the private sector, and their housing benefit goes up as well, so it hasn't actually worked. The benefit cap too, I think in principle the benefit cap is a good thing. The idea that people who are out of work shouldn't receive as much as people who are working seems to be quite sensible. There are problems with it, but I think in general that's okay. So there's an impact that's been had, but whether that's reasonable or not is something we can debate. There have been a number of delays in benefit payments. The Trussell Trust, again, say that nearly a third of those people going to food banks are complaining that their benefits have been delayed. So if the benefit system isn't working, if it's inefficient, or for whatever reason, again, there's a problem. But I have a difficulty with the arguments around sanctions. The Citizens Advice Bureau last year said that they issued 100,000 vouchers, food vouchers to people. Of those, 16% were a consequence of sanctions imposed on people for various reasons, but often because they're not looking for work, and therefore they are reporting to food banks because they're not able to get their benefit anymore. I have a problem with some of the arguments around this because it's assumed that people are wrongly denied their benefits in these cases. But there may well be an argument that people are rightly denied their benefits because they aren't looking for work. But that's not even entertained. So I think it may well be that we need to think about that. Are there instances where people aren't looking for work? So, actually moving on from that, I think there's a general problem in which the food banks has become a vehicle for left-wing or leftish sentiment, and is used in a kind of opportunistic way. So I'll give a few examples of what I mean by that. The very notion of conditionality in the welfare system, the idea that in order to receive benefit you have to be looking for work, or you have to do something in return for that, that is kind of dismissed. That idea of a kind of a contract, an agreement, an informal agreement, is dismissed, and I think that's not reasonable. Conditionality has always been a part of the welfare state since the days of Beveridge. But I think this is part of the problem, is that there's been an outsourcing of responsibility at all levels within the system. So centrally, the central government has abolished the social fund, which was a means of welfare assistance whereby everybody was entitled to the same support. That has been devolved to local authorities and with a less generous settlement. At the local level, job centres are referring on to food banks rather than paying people advances on their benefit. And local authorities too are tending to refer on to benefits in kind rather than cash benefits. So there's both the central level and the local level, there's that kind of refusal to accommodate people's welfare issues. But going back to the political left, there's also a tendency for those who see themselves as opponents of the government and critics of welfare reform to actually argue that people effectively aren't responsible for the circumstances they find themselves in. So they too, their responsibility is being outsourced. So nobody is taking responsibility, in my view, whether it's the state or the individuals themselves. Well, certainly as far as the left talks about people, it talks about them as if they're victims of circumstance, they're passive, they're unable to find a job, they're unable to improve their circumstances. So, there are a number of levels there's an outsourcing of responsibility. There's also, again on the political left, a tendency to blame neoliberalism or to blame the economic structure, which kind of sounds radical. But again, the tendency, I think, is as a result of that, it portrays people as helpless and at the mercy of impersonal forces beyond their control. I don't think that's particularly helpful. I think it's kind of, again, it's looking for somewhere else to find the blame. And I think that's part of the wider culture of vulnerability, this idea that people need continual support, they need to be rescued from their circumstances, they need constant interventions, and again, it tends to feed into this idea that people are kind of passive, that they're unable to do anything but receive a food parcel or receive a benefit. And opportunism, it's very common on the left, but also Justine mentioned the SNP and the Scotland issue. This came up a lot within that independence and referendum campaign, this idea that if you want to be on the right side, the progressive side, you had to criticise welfare reform and have a go at this notion of food banks as being a big issue. And it wasn't just the SNP, the BNP even have been quite opportunistic in their treatment of this issue. In East London, they've set up their own food banks. Obviously, they're not quite as generous in who they give their food to. They don't use vouchers. They kind of basically say if you're a white Indigenous person in East London, then you're entitled to food. But it's kind of noticeable. There's a tendency to kind of jump on this issue as something which kind of shows your moral character and being the right thinking kind of person.
1 minute, Dave.
Okay. So finally, is the UK hungry? Is the UK starving? Or are individuals in the UK starving and hungry? I don't think they are. I think there's a tendency to exaggerate this issue for a number of reasons. However, there is a genuine problem with malnutrition. But it's got very little to do with food banks. There's a problem of, as people get older and become more isolated, they do tend to have problems with eating. This has got well documented. There are figures around of an increase of around 19-20% in the past year or so of the number of people reporting to hospitals with malnutrition. There's a greater awareness of this, and there is a lot of campaigning on the part of health authorities to do this. But less mobility, people not being able to get to the shops, problems with dementia, depression, dentures not fitting correctly. There's a whole host of reasons why all people aren't able to get the food they need. So I think, there is a problem, but food banks aren't going to solve that problem. In fact, it's interesting, finally, that the Lancet, the medical profession journal, and various other campaigners have really latched onto the obesity issue. So instead of arguing that people are actually malnourished, they're saying that the big food poverty issue is that people are obese, i.e. too fat, and that they're eating the wrong kind of food because it's too cheap. So, which is kind of nonsensical. So we have this very strange argument that the real problem with food poverty today is not that people haven't got enough to eat, but that they're able to afford food which is not good for them. So it's a very confused debate, and so that's where I conclude, finally, that no, we don't have a hunger problem in the UK.
Dave, thank you. Okay, Dave had a couple of extra minutes there, so Anne, you get a couple of extra minutes too. So Anne, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, hi, nice to see you all. I hope you can hear me reasonably clearly. Lovely. So it's great to be able to represent the highly controversial at the moment charity, the Trussell Trust, tonight. A charity that I've been working for around 4.5 years now. Started out as a project manager running a food bank project in my local community, then moved on to helping other communities set them up, helped set up around well over 50 projects in the Midlands, and I now cover a much wider area, including the whole of the north of England and Northern Ireland, supporting the staff who do that role, who work with communities at a very broad level to keep the food bank projects that we have sustainable for the long term, if they are still needed in the future. So what's really interesting about the kind of language that we're trying to use very carefully now in the UK is around food bank, that actually we're about much more than food. So our slogan at the moment is more than food. But actually that principle can be tracked right back to the very birth of food bank in the UK. So when food bank first began, it was started as a charity using a very modest legacy to do some work in Bulgaria, in Eastern Europe, because even 18 years ago, when you thought about poverty charity, you did not think immediately of the UK at that time. We used to talk about disadvantaged families. We used that kind of language, particularly in the teaching world, which is where I began. But we didn't think about real poverty and genuine hunger as being anything other than a third world problem. But 18 years ago, when the Trussell Trust first began and was clearly helping people in another country who were in need, they were challenged by local people who said, that's great, what you're doing in Bulgaria is fantastic, but who's going to help me in the UK? Because I've got 3 children about to come home from school. My husband's left me and he's maxed out the credit card, and we've got no food in the house. So what they did back then was twofold. The first thing was that the people running the charity, the couple running that charity, felt they wanted to meet the presenting need, which was to provide some food that would see that family through the weekend in their very changed circumstances. But the second thing they did, which is core to how we work, and I speak obviously on behalf of Trussell Trust food banks, because obviously other food banks have been mentioned tonight. They do exist, they don't necessarily operate in the same way, but how our model works is based on this very first encounter, and that was that they started ringing round in the city of Salisbury to find out who could assist this woman in her changed circumstances, who could give her the advice and the guidance and the expertise that she needed. And on the way, they asked the agencies this question: are there more people like this, or is this an isolated incident? And the answer, resounding answer that came back, in Salisbury, still not really known as an area for abject poverty, even today, and from all the agencies they talked to, was this is by no means an isolated incident. There are people living on the breadline like this all over the city. So that was 18 years ago. They started off with one food bank, which was based on a shed in their back garden, collecting food as they could, but from the beginning they always connected in with agencies and organisations that could help with the underlying causes of poverty. Because what they never intended to do was set up any kind of dependency culture with the clients they worked with. They wanted to empower clients to find the solutions to their situations, and that's how we have always operated through our food bank. So when people say to us, oh, aren't you just sticking a sticking plaster or a plaster on the situation, that is absolutely not the model that we work to. We are about empowering our clients to find solutions. Some of them have been so beaten down by the system that they need some extra assistance to do that. So the way that we make sure that we're giving them the assistance they want is by maintaining this really, at times quite complex, but very complementary relationship with agencies. Everywhere we plant a food bank, it's in partnership with agencies in the communities that can help break the cycle of poverty, which is one of our main aims, is breaking the cycle of poverty. It isn't, I know the word food bank means, in everyone's mind, what you picture is food. And usually now, because of our media coverage, you exactly picture one of our warehouses. But actually, what we've always been about is about breaking the cycle of poverty for people and putting power back in their hands. So by partnering with agencies, we first of all make sure that the people who are referred to Food Bank are genuine clients, are genuinely in need. And an assessment is made by a frontline care professional, such as a social worker, a teacher, sometimes a police officer, a children's centre, family support worker, and the like. These are people who know the clients, know their situation. They know whether there's a partner in the home or not. They know whether there are children in the home or not. They know the circumstances. They have a case file for that client, and they can make a robust assessment. And we basically say to them, we take away any box ticking, we take away any form filling. We say to them, if in your professional judgment, your client, along with all the other advice and guidance you are providing for them, they would benefit from an emergency food parcel of 3 days worth of nutritionally balanced food, is what we've constructed with the aid of dietitians, then you can refer them to Food Bank. Now, one of the safety measures we put in place around that is we say to those agencies, we rely on your professional judgment, and that is the strength, I think, of our referral process. People can't self-refer. They have to be getting help from somewhere to get a voucher as well. But one of the safety measures we build in around that is we say to those agencies, you can refer this client to us up to 3 times per crisis. But at that point, we want to have a little pause when we have a conversation, because we want to work out, are you still helping that client deal with the underlying causes of their situation? Are you still giving them the help they need? Is the client still working hard to get out of his or her situation as well? And then thirdly, are you actually still the right agency to be working with this client? So you might have somebody who presents, first of all, as having, there's been let's say a relationship breakdown, perhaps a loss of the main wage earner in the home, and suddenly there are people in that family who are struggling to manage. That's a crisis. That's an intervention that can be offered to that family until they get settled. What then might happen is they might manage for a while, but then a fresh crisis breaks out. And actually, that's because over a long period of time, some other factors have crept in. There might be a debt problem, and actually, it's a different agency might need to get involved to refer that family on the basis of a fresh crisis, but a fresh situation. So we don't allow an open-ended referral process, even with the agencies. So we build in lots of safety measures around that. One of the things that we do provide in a food bank centre, in order to make sure that it's about more than food, is we make sure that the clients who come are not treated as a number. They're not treated as just a list of people with problems to be fixed, if you like, or a solution to be offered that's just a quick fix solution. We would provide an environment that's warm and friendly, where a client can sit together with a trained volunteer to share a cup of tea, and if they want to, they can tell their story about why they've got to the point where they have. And interestingly, although we're very clear in training that volunteers are not to ask probing questions, probing personal, nosy questions, but they can sit there as a listening ear, and as they're listening, they are thinking through, who could I further refer this client to? Who could I tell them about that's going to give them the help they need? So they may have been referred to us by one agency. Let's say a social worker has referred them because of a situation they're receiving help with. They may or may not have told the social worker about some other circumstances that have crept in. They may have been afraid to, but they may tell us, and we may be able to give them some helpful information that can support them through that situation. So more than food is the watchword, not only in terms of our partnership with agencies, but in terms of our relationship there and then with the client at the food bank centre. We know that people need more than food. Food is just meeting the presenting issue, which is hunger. And it's interesting, of course, we're going to have some chance to debate tonight, but I can tell you about clients that I've met personally, actually some of them quite recently, where they are turning up to food banks. Increasingly these days, we're seeing people who haven't eaten for several days. And I know that unless you live in this world, that's quite hard to believe, that somebody in the UK would literally not have anything to eat. So we see a lot of people, a lot of research has been done around this. So Mumsnet did a piece of research around this. Lots of people we know are doing without meals so the children can eat. So we know that. So some people will do without lunch so the children can have it. Many people are just too embarrassed to access the support they need through food banks. So rather than this being something, and we'll talk further about this tonight, I'm sure, something which lots of, to use political rhetoric of recent months, wasters and scroungers and lazy people will want to take advantage of free food, we see the opposite issue. We see many people out there who are too embarrassed to access the help that is on offer, meaning that when they actually come to us, they literally haven't eaten for several days. And I'm going to, so much more to say. But basically, just to reiterate, we're about so much more than food. Thank you.
And finally, Richard.
Good evening. Back in 2002, 12 years ago, Graham Riches, a Canadian scholar, said, in countries where food banks are in their infancy, the question of whether to support their development should be a matter of urgent public debate. And that is exactly where I feel that the UK is now. We're quite a long way behind the likes of the US and Canada and New Zealand and Australia. So, whilst I acknowledge the validity of Dave's questioning whether people are genuinely hungry, and I'll come back to that perhaps later on, I don't think that's the crux of the issue. I think the real crux of the issue that we should be considering tonight is whether the emergency food model is an appropriate way to address hunger. And I'm going to draw on some small-scale research that I've done myself, as well as other research in the field. And I want to look at two particular areas. Firstly, I want to consider how food bank is actually experienced. And secondly, what I consider to be the problems with the food bank model. Whilst I don't suggest that the experience of receiving food is universally or uniformly negative, the overwhelming emotion that people who have spoken to, participants, is one of shame. It was Amartya Sen who said, shame is at the irreducible absolutist core of poverty. And certainly in my research, colloquialisms of shame were used in nearly every single interview on very frequent basis. Words such as embarrassing, desperate, it's weird, scary, ashamed, trepidation, nervous, negative. And I think those emotions demonstrate that shame is a self-conscious emotion, and it can be sort of, within yourself, it portrays a feeling of a lack of adequacy, an unworthiness. But more than that, it also, when it comes down to food, which is a basic need of ours, food is a massive social marker, in my opinion. It sort of distinguishes between those who have and those who have not, those who have choice, those who don't have choice. And it means that somebody who ends up going to a food bank, they have a lack of autonomy, they have a lack of independence, they don't have those choices. The second part of that is that there's also very little research into why people, or how many people even, actually don't go to food banks. It was only very recently in my other career as an advice worker, I had a couple come to me, and they were in their 50s, and unfortunately the woman was unemployed. The man had had an accident recently, and their only income was statutory sick pay. It was £88 a week. And they also had, unfortunately, their housing benefit didn't cover their rent. So after they'd paid the surplus rent themselves, for themselves, they had left over £23 a week. And that was to cover their food, their electric, their heating, their gas, their clothes, their travel, their telephone, because they're trying to look, the woman was looking for work, their toiletries. That was for every single thing. So at the end of the advice session, I, rather reluctantly, but inevitably I suppose, offered them a food bank voucher. And the woman sort of looked at me, was not quite sure. But the man turned and he said, "I'm not going to no food bank." He goes, "I've worked all my life. I'd rather starve and die before I go to a food bank." Now that is only one experience, I acknowledge, and it's not everybody's experience. But if food banks now do form our new social safety net, what do we do with that person who is living off £23 a week as a couple? How do we actually provide for them and actually maintain their dignity? As I said, the other part of the other side of the coin, and I think it's fair to say, to make this point, is that Food Bank actually did come out as a very stark contrast to the impersonal interactions that many people have with the state, the DWP, the local authority. And some of that was expressed as a relief, and people felt that they had a voice, they were listened to, that they weren't judged, and I certainly think that that is something that can be built upon. But, and this is where I have a problem with the food bank model, if we look at internationally, we can see that there is massive uncertainty and unevenness in provision. This is just from the pragmatic perspective. If we accept food bank as the way forward, the sustainability of the model is very, very doubtful in my opinion. We look at funding. At the moment, funding a food bank is fine. It is in vogue. Everybody seems to be going along with it. That is certainly not the case in places like New Zealand and Australia. In Australia, last year, 65,000 people every month were turned away from food banks because they didn't have enough food to provide. They're also spatially or located, not necessarily in areas that match need. This was something that came out when I was talking to the head of public affairs for the Salvation Army, where quite often the Trussell Trust are set up in reasonably affluent areas where the need is more often than not in more deprived areas. There's also the unreliability of future donations, and I don't mean just literally ourselves as individuals, but also corporates, supermarkets, and so forth. I want to just tell you, though, a couple of, one story, and forgive me if you've heard this story before, but it's about a little village, and there's a river running through this village. And one day, they see a baby floating down the river, and the villagers dive into the river, drag the baby out, they clothe it, they feed it, they save it. The following day, there's 2 babies that come down the river, and they do the same. Before too long, we find that there's a number of babies, quite a lot of babies coming down the river, and in fact, what we find is that the whole village has actually dedicated their lives to pulling these babies out of the river. When one villager says, just hold on one second, don't you think we need to be going up the river and find out why these babies are getting thrown in? But the other villagers say, no, we can't do that just at the moment, we haven't got time. Because if we do that, there's going to be a load of babies that are going to die, who are going to drown in the meantime. Now, I'm sure you can gather my analogy of this, and I'm not necessarily saying that Trussell Trust or in fact FareShare or any of the other providers necessarily ignore what is going on upstream, but I certainly think the dedication of resources is very, very much focused on what is going on downstream and certainly not focusing on campaigning and changing why people are coming to food banks.
1 minute, Richard.
Okay. Finally, the other thing is charity allows us to feel warm. So, as a volunteer, we all enjoy doing something good. Similarly, donors enjoy giving. It's much nicer to give some food than it is to see something coming off your payslip at the end of the month. Similarly, celebrities and corporates are able to sell their corporate social responsibility for these issues. And my question is this. That in itself is not a problem. Charity is good, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But my question is, and I say, well, I suggest legitimising charity as a solution to resolving hunger fails to address the political legitimacy of a system when wants could be so easily satisfied. It is not beyond the realms to actually have sufficient for everybody. And what if by helping the hungry we divert ourselves from pursuing more fundamental solutions to the problems of hunger, and that actually in fact aids the, in my opinion, neoliberal agenda of eroding our welfare state.
Richard, thank you very much. Gosh, so much to get stuck into, I don't know where to start. I'm going to give the panellists an opportunity to tackle anything they've heard their fellow debaters say that they particularly like to take up. Just to kick things off, if that's okay, just Richard, as you finished, you were talking about the shame that people who have to use food banks might feel. How then would you, just off the top of your head right now, explain the apparent huge increase in uptake of food bank usage? If it's really so shameful, why are so many people using food banks?
I think there's a number of different reasons, and I think, unfortunately, the Trussell Trust are the main providers of statistics, but I'm not sure that their collection of statistics is that robust, because it basically involves a tick on a voucher as to the reason. But I think it's fair to say my own view, and it was a very small scale project, was that benefit levels are too low, particularly for young people. Living off £55 a week is next to impossible to do sustainably week in, week out. So welfare reform, and I could bore you to bits for ages about that, has had a very, very major impact. But I think it's also fair to say, in defence of Dave, yes, there is a massive, huge supply there, and I think the state see food banks as a potential option to divert people who are in need for them, and I think that's also another reason.
Okay, obviously Anne representing the Trussell Trust keeps being mentioned, so I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Yes, obviously not. Our figures aren't very robust apparently, but they are being quoted quite a bit tonight. One of the interesting things about our figures is that is why the media like us, is because we do keep accurate records. And we don't claim to have the figures for certain aspects of food bank, but we do just keep records of how many people fed and the main reason given by the referral agency and so on. But that very simple data just tells us an awful lot. On top of that, we collect a lot of anecdotal evidence. Oxfam, for instance, has done some research work with us and has spent time with clients digging underneath the presenting issue to the reasons why the client has been in that situation, and their report will be published, and that will be very interesting. Some of it's already gone into the recent Under the Breadline report. One of the things that I just out of interest would like to pick up on is the reference to the apparently we set up lots of food banks in affluent areas where the real poverty doesn't exist. So I'd just like to make a little comment about that, if I may, because I, in the Midlands, for instance, set up food banks in some very posh areas, some very affluent areas, such as Stratford upon Avon, Henley and Arden, and the like, so some really lovely areas. But before going into those areas, we did some due diligence on what the actual need was, and obviously there are no areas in the UK where there aren't pockets of poverty. So the Henley and Arden food bank is never going to be as busy as one of my Birmingham city central food banks, but there are real pockets of poverty, particularly in the rural communities. And so every time we set up a food bank, it is for a reason, and it's for a reason that the community tell us, and the agencies, the social workers and the like in that area tell us that there is a need for it. So I just wanted to set the record straight on that one.
So Dave, you said you didn't really think anyone was really starving in modern Britain, and Anne says the Trussell Trust sees people who haven't eaten for days. So who's right, you or Anne?
Well, I'd be interested to know how many of those 938,000 last year who were seeing the Trussell Trust, how many of those hadn't eaten for 4 days? Are we talking? It's interesting that you talk about the need being defined by the professionals and how that's a good thing, but you could also say that's a bad thing in as far as you've got no control over that process, in as far as you're taking on trust. The social worker's definition of the needs of their clients, which are social by definition, are going to be as good as a doctor's or another professional. It seems that they will use whatever opportunities they have to help their clients, and if that means ticking a box for a voucher, then they'll do that. I'm just very struck by the number of levels of dependency that seem to be apparent in this. So people who are already dependent are then referred on to the Trussell Trust or another food bank or another network, and yet they're already dependent, and you're talking about empowering them. But it seems like they're getting caught up in a whole network of relationships with officialdom in which charities like the Trussell Trust are effectively becoming a part of. They're becoming an extended part of the state, which is, it may feel a bit more friendly, but it's still kind of, I'd be worried that people are going to get entangled in that. It's not supporting them so much, it's actually creating more problems.
Yeah, I think this issue of what is hunger is quite interesting, because I think there's more to it than establishing the truth or falsity of claims to need. It's almost as though Dave's saying, are they really hungry? And I think hunger is something that is quite subjective. It doesn't literally have to mean, in my opinion, that somebody has been starving for 4 days. It can be quite simply that a parent has been skipping 2 meals a day so that their children can eat. It can be quite literally, I mean, if we talk about literal hunger, there could be somebody as homeless out there tonight who has a meal tonight. They're not hungry just at that very moment, but they have no idea where their next meal is going to be coming from. So I think hunger as such is more difficult, and this became a very political discussion in the mid-80s in America, when they're sort of 20 years before us. And so I think it's more than the semantics of what this actually means. I think it's actually, what I would say though is, if we look at just one statistic, and this is very much, I think, very interesting. The JRF, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, minimum income standard, which is the acceptable, what the public think is the acceptable standard of living. Between 2008 to 2011, 900,000, funnily enough, it was the same figure, more people fell under the minimum income standard in those 3 years. So something's happening out there. What the levels of hunger, whether it's starvation, is perhaps another question.
So Anne, I mean, back to your slogan of more than food, it's a social provision you help provide. It may just be taking away the distress of not being quite sure where you're going to get food for the next few days from, but it's one of those things that takes a level of pressure off people while they focus on other things, right? So it's not, perhaps we're focusing too much on whether people are going hungry or not, and that's obviously the way the discussion takes place in the media. I mean, would you concur with that?
Yes, we do. We provide a breathing space for clients so that they can access the help that they need. So some of the people that come to us have gone down a very negative spiral for a long period of time. So sometimes things happen to them. Some of the clients we see, they're not necessarily people that have been long-term impoverished in some way. For instance, it could be somebody who's had to flee a domestic violence situation. So that's a crisis. And they need an intervention for a period of time, but will quickly get back on their feet, for example. So our clients vary a lot. But I wanted to also to pick up on the idea of the, which is very prevalent out there, that we are somehow bailing out a failing welfare state system, or that we're becoming an extension of that. And one of the things that is helpful to define is that the model that we use, that the Trussell Trust uses, so recognising again there are other models out there, is the frontline food bank model, which is a world away from Australia, Canada, US models, which is the warehouse model, the sort of very much the food bank, whereas the massive warehouse where there is food and people get to come and access it. So our model is very unique in this country, and therefore not to be compared with other places. And the way that we maintain our independence from the state is that there are many ways that we do that. One is that we don't take government money to subsidise what we do. We have a very interesting relationship with local authorities, and we're very careful to keep our distance from any control by them. Where we do partner with local authority agencies, departments if you like, we're very careful to police and monitor their use of our vouchers. But basically we use tens of thousands of frontline care professionals across the country. They can't all be having the wool pulled over their eyes. So that's just too big a statement to make.
Dave, do you want to come back on any of that quickly before I go out?
Yes, just on Richard's point that he says hunger is subjective, I can't think of anything more objective. Surely, if you're without food, you're hungry, and if that goes on for a certain period, you're going to die. That's pretty objective. There's nothing around interpretation there, I don't think. The problem is that the word hunger is used continuously. It's not an accident. That's used by the Trussell Trust. These are food banks. They're where people go to get food to relieve hunger. And this is the language that's used all the time. It's a very deliberate exaggeration of the problem, a very deliberate emotionalising of the problem. And I think that kind of causes a real confusion in people's minds. They don't know what it is we're dealing with. And I think that's why it's so fascinating. Because it's such a struggle to try and find out what's underlying this rise in the uptake of food parcels. On the other hand, this more than food idea, which the Trussell Trust do, and also other food banks around the world have got into this idea that food banks have to be more than just food, more than the stick and plaster. That's almost worse, because what that also means is that instead of empowering people, you're actually drawing people into this relationship with the food banks and with the extended state and other agencies. It becomes about your ability to budget. It becomes about your mental health. All sorts of issues are drawn in. You're actually drawn into a closer relationship with the state and authorities than you would have been otherwise. I'd much prefer to go to a food bank if I was genuinely hungry, take my food and go.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Right, very controversial issue this, lots of different opinions on all sides. Very keen to find out what the audience make of what our speakers have said. You may have questions for them, you may just have comments. Can I see who might like to ask a question or make a point? Good, right, so I'm going to take a little cluster of questions. That both gives the speakers a split second to think about how they might like to respond to you, but it also moves us away just from a straightforward question and answer with more of a discussion. So can I take you here? Oh, good.
Okay. I am a vicar in Leeds, and I work very closely with the Trussell Trust, whilst at the same time absolutely agreeing with everything that Richard was saying about it stopping the debate about how appropriate provision is done. I give a lot of time and energy to working with the food bank that runs in our city, but it isn't the long-term answer. And I think I want to see how that debate can go forward that isn't in a way attacking those who are trying to respond, and therefore not really engaging with the issue. Because what I heard was a lot of attacking of what Trussell Trust are doing. Now, I struggle with that sometimes, but I get on and do it because it's something. How do we really have a debate without attacking people?
Thank you very much. Where did the other hands go? There were a few more. There's a chap here at the front.
Hi, I've just been at a meeting with Catherine at the town hall, and we had a presentation on welfare reforms. This is more aimed at Richard as well. And he was saying that overall he just thinks the benefits are just too low. That there's all this talk about sanctions and everything else, but overall they're just too low, so he'd probably agree with you on that. But is it not really important, Richard, that we do both at the same time, a bit like what Catherine's trying to do? We do the immediate food aid provision and get good coordination around that in our towns and cities. And at the same time we come here and have debates about this kind of stuff and try to impact policy within people's political values. The problem I would have is that I was hearing about another city this week where they can't even do that coordination on the ground because all they do is talk about the bigger arguments like we're doing here. And I think you've got to separate them out to some extent and do both. So I don't know if you could give us any feedback on that.
Okay, have a think of that, Richard. Other points and questions? Yeah, they're at the end of the strategy.
I think that I sort of see the food banks as first aid, really. So it's the point that people come to, the point of service, really, that people see, and they come to that to get the food. And there is definitely deeper issues that need to be explored, and things need to be changed in the state and how welfare is applied and things like that. But I think my point is aimed at David, really, because you said that you think you would rather go to a food bank, be given some food and leave, whereas I quite strongly feel that engagement is firstly the first step on the road for someone to be getting back onto their feet and getting back. And if someone comes to a food bank and gets some food, I think they want that help. If they didn't want the help, they would do what I can't remember the name, the Citizen Advice Bureau did, and say, no, I'm not going to that food bank because at this moment in time I don't want that help. So I think that people who go to the food bank will want that engagement, and I don't know if Anne, with her first-hand experience, can tell us a bit more about that.
Thank you, thanks so much for that. Any more at this stage? Okay, there's a little gaggle of questions there. So, who would like to come back first? Dave, you'll kind of grab the food and go, not good enough, you obviously need help from the state.
There's two answers to this. The first answer is, of course, a small minority of individuals, some of whom it seems are already in the food bank system, have other needs. And they may be to do with all sorts of things, their mental health, their income. There's a whole host of needs that somebody might present with. And as somebody who's worked in social care, I understand that. What I'm saying is that there's a bigger problem in as far as we make certain assumptions about people if we think they can't run their own lives without that support. We're not talking about a small minority of people. Increasing numbers of people are drawn into that relationship, and it's built on this assumption that people aren't able to manage. They aren't able to draw on their own resources, whether that's their actual physical resources or whether that's their ability just to be resilient, or whether it's drawing on family, friends, community. You might say food banks are part of the community, but as I say, I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I think they've become much more drawn into this very bureaucratic relationship of handing out parcels because somebody filled out a voucher. So I don't think that engagement is as benign as you think. I think there's something really quite problematic about that, and I think we should be more suspicious of what that does to people's ability to actually cope and prosper and actually do better without certain interventions. And just one thing that you mentioned regarding having the debate. Obviously we are having a debate, and it's striking that the food bank's discussion is very, very constrained and actually quite narrow. The official version is probably quite rightly dismissed. The notion that food banks are on the rise simply because they're there is nonsense. It doesn't explain why they're there, it doesn't explain what's happening, and that's the official view. But the unofficial view, which is dominant, is this argument that welfare is a problem, austerity is a problem, and etc., etc. Anybody who actually challenges that is actually quite swiftly told that they mustn't say that, or they mustn't disagree. So there was the Daily Mail journalist who went to a food bank pretending to be somebody in need, needing food, wrote an article afterwards claiming that some of the people there didn't really need to be there. Whatever the arguments, whatever the right and wrong of that, they were rubbish. They quite kind of drastically told that this is a terrible thing. How dare you do this? How dare you write about food banks in this way? And that's not healthy. We need to have those kind of voices. We need people who are going to disagree with the dominant orthodoxy. So I think there is an orthodox position on food banks, and there's very little appetite for people who counter that.
Okay.
Without wanting to sound like I totally disagree, I just want to pick up on your point a little bit, because I think it leads into some other things, which is this idea again that we've referred to about stopping the debate by having food banks. I would, this is going to be very controversial, okay, and feel free to shoot me down, but I'm going to stick my neck out, and I would say that I would go as far as to say that we have had the single biggest influence in stirring the debate in the last 20 years. So far from stopping it, we've engaged with it, we've stirred it up. We are in many ways a thorn in politicians' sides. Yeah. So people have wanted to use us for politicised reasons. So the Scottish independence vote, which obviously better together, was ludicrously keen to use the idea of food banks to rubbish being part of the Westminster government. But we have contributed to the upcoming APPG report, the All-Party Parliamentary Group report, which will come out in January, February. We provoked the government into producing the recent DEFRA report, which absolutely puts to bed forever the myth that there are more people attending food banks because the Trussell Trust is setting up more food banks. So that myth is put to bed forever by the government's own commissioned report. And I recommend it for your bedtime reading because it's completely independent of us, and it really goes into the complexity of poverty and hunger, actual hunger, in the UK, and it's a very credible piece of research backed up by lots of other research that is around. So I just want to make that point, that actually the debate is alive and well. We're happy to be controversial. We engage with politicians all the time, including at the very highest level, because we want to make sure that voices are heard that wouldn't otherwise be heard. So although we are not technically a campaigning charity, we're not allowed to be, that's not our definition. And we do expect other groups, such as some of the churches' organisations that do campaigning, we expect you to do that. We do the bit that we are very good at, and we will carry on doing it, but we will carry on being a voice for those who have no voice.
Can I ask, just out of interest, is anyone here, unlikely I suspect, does anyone here use the food bank? No? Anyone would use a food bank if they felt they had to? Okay. Fine. So when I'm keen to come back to the audience. I want to give Richard an opportunity to come back if he'd like to. But can the audience have a think about the debate as it takes place in the media and as you'll see it discussed in the news? Are people being lazy scroungers and taking food because it's there? Is there a real need? Is there real poverty? Has poverty changed in the last decade? I'd be really, really interested to find out what some of you guys think in the audience as well. Richard, is there anything you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I think the first point I'll just very briefly address is this notion that food banking is very bureaucratic. In fairness, that is just quite simply not the case, actually. It is actually one of the least bureaucratic forms of charity that I've ever experienced. And I think Anne's absolutely right to point out that it is about a crisis management, in fairness. I have concerns about the impact of that, but using her statistics, or Trussell Trust statistics, I think it's something like most people come to see the food bank 1.4 times on average, something in that region. So they don't tend to come back 3 times. They don't come back loads and loads of times. It's a crisis. They try and get over it. Now, I'd just like to address the point that you made and that you made there. I certainly think that, yes, we've got to think about solutions. It's all very well sort of shooting from the hip and saying, well, this is a major problem and it's no good. How do we solve it? Well, one of the strengths that I actually found in my own research is that Trussell Trust are very good, in my opinion, at forming relationships with their users. Not in every single food bank, but I certainly think in quite a lot they are very good at forming relationships. And that is very different to what most individuals who are in need experience when they come to the state. I've already said that. So I don't actually agree with Anne in terms of saying that at the moment the model is hugely empowering. I think it does fulfil a sticking plaster need. That's fine. There is a model in Canada, funnily enough, and there's a book written about it, which I can very much recommend, called The Stop. And this is an organisation which is like a food bank, but it's very much driven from bottom up, if you like. So the users actually become the people who run, effectively, the food bank, and they diversify into lots of different areas. They sell the food, they make the food, they grow the food, they'll cook the food, and so they'll do all sorts of different things. And my own view is that is a much more productive model to seek to go down than the current one. And I would also suggest that if we really want to go further, I think, yes, Trussell Trust do stick their neck out a little bit against the prevailing political ideology. But I think what is really needed is actually to give the people themselves, who are users, the opportunity to express their own political agency, and I say that with a small p, to actually, if they want to, campaign and explain what they feel, what their voice is. Let them have their voices heard. It's so rare, and this is right across the board. This is just not restricted to food banking. This is right across the board. We hear poverty porn galore, and we hear lots of other people's views. We don't hear the users' views, the people who really are in desperate need view. And I think that is something that Trussell Trust and Fair Share and other food providers could do an awful lot more. And I think that would have a far bigger impact in terms of, like, the objective should be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we don't have food banks in this country. how do we get to that? And I think that's one of the ways that we can hope to do so.
Okay, following on from that, one of the things I think Dave is suggesting is that rather than give people agency or empowering them, in fact, food banks and other social services through the state actually deny people agency to a degree, because you become increasingly dependent on the state supporting you in some form or the other, or social services or charitable services. What does that do to the individual? I think that's worth having a look at, following on from what Richard said. But questions, points? Can't believe you all agree with the speakers, so chap at the
I
end.
disagree with that point of view entirely, because there is real poverty, real hunger. It's experienced clearly by quite a number of people, and there are haves and have-nots. It's quite possible the haves largely outnumber the have-nots, that they're kept away from the information. They don't know about this. They don't know enough about the poverty and the impoverishment that exists. And that's the fault of the media and the government.
Thank you. Right, Paul.
I've got a question for each, really. I mean, Dave, you wrote about the death of community being greatly exaggerated, but as there has been a decline in traditional forms of solidarity that was smashed throughout the 80s and things like that. Aren't food banks perhaps filling something that more informal things in the past would have filled? Isn't that a problem? And I wanted to say, if this is such a long problem that's been going on for so long, wouldn't we expect the poor sections of the working class to actually do something about it other than traipse into food banks? Wouldn't we expect to see people campaigning like people did on Jarrow marches in the ground in the past, coming out and demanding jobs and growth, demanding something real rather than just taking arms from food banks? And Richard, I agree with your concern about autonomy in relation to the food banks, but isn't the greater problem the lack of the fact that these people are state dependent? That by being a state dependent, you kind of automatically lack autonomy before you even go to the food banks. So the real problem is that they're on welfare, not kind of in the first place, not that they're going to food banks.
Thanks, Paul. Other points, questions? Anyone annoyed you? This is the time to speak up. No? Oh, Dan, on the camera.
Just like to sort of try and pick apart this notion of empowerment, because I'm thinking about, the question, would you go to a food bank? And a lot of people said, I'd go to a food bank. But then would the same people who said that say that they need empowerment? Because it's easier to imagine ourselves in situations where, you've had a breakup of your relationship, you do need to move, for these particular sort of crisis circumstances, if you like, that where you think, right, well, I'll go and get some food and that'll sort of help me through. But then the idea that you need empowering, I think, is perhaps less easy to accept, and maybe it sort of reflects either a view of ourselves or a view of others as being somehow sort of less capable, than what they really are. And I was thinking about the perceptions of the poor, if you like. It seems that the poor are in some ways divided into the sort of the dangerous, the hard and the dangerous, the problem families, and the weak and the vulnerable. And I wonder if that's true. Are there sort of some people who don't need empowering and some people who do need empowering?
Okay. Richard, why don't we come back to you first, because I keep picking on you last time.
Let me just touch on that. I think you're absolutely right, Dan, to say there are some people who need empowering, or don't need empowering, but perhaps would appreciate empowering. And I think it would be very wrong for us to suggest that people need empowering. And certainly, some people just want some help. And I think that's absolutely reasonable. In certain situations, they may have all sorts of issues that none of us can necessarily comprehend, and therefore they're not in a place where they can exercise, the political agency that I've just been talking about. But I think others are angry, others are very, very cross, and they do want to have a voice, and they do want to be able to be heard. So, coming back to Paul's question, is the real reason that people are state dependent that they're going to food banks? Well, I suppose to an extent the state is certainly, and I mean the local state as well as the national state, and I think it's slightly disingenuous to suggest that Trussell Trust are not embroiled in the state, because they are funded in many cases, not entirely, but they do get funding quite a lot from local authorities who get their funding from the central state. So I think that's a point. But I think to come back to your point, yes, people are state dependent, but I think that it's a far wider issue, if you want my honest opinion on that. To say, why are they on welfare? Well, we could talk about that, and we could talk about the evolution of precarity over the last sort of 10 years, with low-paid jobs, with unsecure jobs, with zero-hour contracts, and we could talk about poor housing, we can talk about all sorts of potential structural issues. That's not to say people shouldn't, on occasion, take responsibility. Conditionality is a massive part of our welfare system now. There is almost no unconditional benefit that exists, to be quite honest. Even council tax support in Leeds next year will be conditional on engagement with employment initiatives. So I think we have to be a little bit careful to sort of suggest that people are state dependent. They sometimes find themselves dependent on the state, but not necessarily through any fault of their own.
Okay, Dave.
Okay, there's a lot been said about empowerment and people who go to food banks not having a voice, being voiceless. I think that the very act of going to a food bank to collect your food, or the very act of going to the job centre and being given a benefit, makes you passive and makes you voiceless. It's in the relationship that you have. It's not, you can't change that model within that relationship and expect any other outcome. That's just the nature of that relationship is entirely passive. You are by definition voiceless. So I think we need to look beyond that, and in previous times we would have had a more politicised discussion. There would have been political parties and political movements that were about genuinely empowering people, because it was on the basis of representing memberships, or on representing people like you, having an alliance of some sort. That's not happening at the moment. That's in the past. So I think that would be the first point I'd make. I was struck that quite a few hands went up when people were asked, would you attend a food bank, even though nobody would admit to having gone to one. So you might say the audience has no shame. And I don't think that's an entirely positive thing. I think the whole point of communities, as Paul referred to, is that there are taboos, there are shameful things. And I would argue that a healthy community would find somebody attending a food bank a problem. They wouldn't approve of it. I think they'd feel the same about somebody going to the welfare state and not working for their income. That would be regarded as something which undermines the community itself. A healthy community looks after its own members. And if some of its members are in need, it supports them. The welfare state is external to that. Food banks, at the moment, are external to that, unless they're set up by the community itself. So I think some of these questions are a bit more complicated, and in the past it would have been different. A healthy community that it feels that it can be independent of the state and it feels that it can rely on its informal mechanisms is a good thing, and it's something that we need more of. And a certain set of values come with that. People aren't regarded as universally vulnerable. They're regarded as relatively independent, albeit within the context of interdependencies within that community. So, I think there's problems with the very notion of going to a food bank in the first place.
Okay. That must have provoked some reaction from you. Dave just called some of you shameless for taking charity.
I mean, frankly, if you're very hungry, you go to where the food is, unless you want to go into prostitution or something. It's absurd.
Do feel free to jump in.
I mean, but of course, Dave, with all respect, well, sorry, not very much. You don't accept that people are hungry, that this real hunger exists. So I can see your point of view, in a sense.
Do you want to come back on that?
I argue that the problem of hunger is exaggerated, and I think both of my fellow panel members have accepted that. I think they haven't said that I'm wrong on that.
Okay, they can come back in that minute. So chap here at the front.
Yeah, what you're saying about a community, if someone was hungry or out of work, a community looking after their own, I think it all sounds like a very nice idea, and that's kind of the whole big society thing. It all sounds really good, and you can see how in the past that would have possibly happened more and more as communities were far smaller and more closed. But I don't see how now that can be seen as a feasible system, as communities are so loose, people move away from their families, communities are so big, and you don't necessarily know your neighbour like people would have 100 years ago. So as nice an idea as it sounds, I just think it's completely impractical. And the fact that communities are lumped, so there's poor community, then a rich community, then so I don't see how that can be raised as any kind of solution, which is why the welfare state is necessary.
Okay. Do you have a point here? Question?
Yes, I was just wondering about the expansion of the food bank industry as an industry. Can anybody see it will expand so far that it will mean the demolition of the welfare state?
Okay. Yeah, Richard.
I think that's a massive concern, and already, to give you an example, Dave spoke earlier on in his talk about crisis loans, and crisis loans have been localised. So now, if you are in crisis, you go to your local authority, and each local authority has its own scheme, and it's designed in its own way. And some local authorities don't have a scheme. And what happens, or what has happened more and more, is that the people who would go to that now get referred to the food bank. Okay? So Dave also spoke about short-term benefit advances. I saw a client who went to the DWP, they'd made a claim for a benefit, but it had been delayed. So they were referred to their local authority. So they went to the local authority and said, I understand I need to claim for this emergency help. And they said, well, actually, we're not that fast at sorting it out. Why don't you go to CAB? Because they'll give you a food bank voucher. So went to the CAB and they got a food bank voucher. And that is a huge, massive issue. And strangely enough, those emergency schemes have been underutilised because they've not been marketed very well, so people don't necessarily know about them. So now politicians will rely on that to say, actually, we don't have a need because actually we can refer people to the food bank. And it was David Freud, Lord Freud, who said recently that they should ramp up. You know, he's actively encouraging the food bank industry, basically benefit in kind.
Okay. But in the process of ramping it up then, organisations like social services department surely become redundant eventually. It won't be necessary because the food bank industry will be playing that role.
People should feel free to chip in. I'm in charge, so if it all gets out of control, it's my fault. But I would like to.
Can I just say, what you're saying sounds like the wrong way around. Feels to me as if food banks is growing because state is becoming less. It's reactive rather than proactive. I really wish that we could be proactive in this rather than simply reacting to the stuff that's happening around us.
Okay. I'll come out for a final round of questions in a moment, but I've not taken Anne for a while. So, Anne, Trussell Trust destroying the welfare state. You'll use as a shameless, all sorts of things on the table.
Oh, I don't know where to begin. Right, so I know we have 2 minutes right at the very end, so there might be some things I'll pick up on then. But I was really interested in your comment at the end about the how community is different now. And on the one hand, I absolutely agree with you. So community does not look today, the urban community does not look today like it did, certainly in my childhood, which I won't say when that was, but things have moved on in just a few decades. However, the really amazing thing about food banks is, contrary to what has been said, is they are set up and run by communities. That is the community at work. Now, granted, we've had to give them some structure and some guidelines, and we have to think, because we live in a very litigious society, we have to think about legal compliances and so on in a way that perhaps a few decades ago we didn't really worry about that. So given that the nature of society has changed profoundly at so many levels, this is still community at work. It is actually amazing. So on the one hand, if I think about our 1,200 food bank centres in the UK, 1,200 just that we support by the Trussell Trust, each one of them is a shame at one level to the country that it's needed, but each one of them is a testimony to the amazing community cohesion of ordinary local people, faith groups in the community, supermarkets, businesses. Everybody has worked together to make that happen. It's amazing.
Okay. Audience, any final points from you? Yes, at the front end.
Yeah, I'm obviously still reflecting on all what Free have said, and thank you. And dare I say, no one's used it yet, but it's food for thought. However, it's not going to stop me completing the application form for food banks that I'm going to this week in obviously the area in North Leeds.
Are you creating a food bank or setting one up?
An outlet.
Involved in an outlet,
Right.
yes. And what I like about it, and obviously I've still got much more to learn, is the fact that it is much more than food. And because I don't see it as making people voiceless, I see them as signposts and pointing them to other areas if they want to take up our advice. And I think that's the point. And I dare I say, as a contrast in my job that I do as a workplace rep, you advise people on what to do. They make the choice whether they want to take you up on that. And so in the same vein, I see the food banks similarly to that. It's more than just food, that's just the presenting problem. And I guess the whole other point you was talking about, shame. For me, I see vulnerability as a strength. I always have done. I'll make myself vulnerable, that's me. And I think sometimes that goes with our culture. We don't like to, say what our weaknesses are. But actually, perhaps because of the time and the recession that we've been through, some people are beginning to be more vulnerable and able to help those people that don't want to. Again, it is their choice. So that's just my points.
Thank you. Speakers, once I've done this round of questions, I'll come back for your final thoughts. You won't necessarily be able to deal with everything, but any key points you want to take up, that's the time to do it. So chap at the front.
I think people on benefits are much more resilient than they're being portrayed. My brother-in-law and his wife, my brother-in-law spends most of they lost money on the what's the word for it, the bedroom tax, so they lost some of their benefits. My brother-in-law does cars repairs 3 or 4 times a week. He gets reported every other week and has to do it in the back garden half the time. His wife goes off cleaning down to Round A Park to an old gent's house twice a week for cash in hand. They do a car boot every other 2 or 3 weeks with stuff they've got given and donated to them and stuff they get in charity shops. My brother-in-law goes rabbiting with his dog for food. He comes back with fish and rabbits. And if you want to know the best place for rabbits, it's up at Weatherby Trading Centre where he goes. His wife often goes off quarter to 8 down to Tesco's because he knows that the food's reduced there. And I've been in the house when the local thieves come round. They're often stuff that's been knocked off in the various supermarkets. But generally, people are resilient. And I do accept, old people and people on benefits and young people, single kids have problems. But the average person in Seacroft regards that check benefits as the start of the week, and they've got a lot of things to add to it themselves.
Okay, it's an interesting point. More resilient than dependent. See, our new hands will go up right at the end. So right at the back there.
And obviously the subject of this evening's conversation is about food banks, but we haven't touched at all on the increasing reuse of waste food. And I just wondered if any of the panellists wanted to comment on that before the evening finished.
Thank you. And there was one floating around back here. Yeah, thank you.
I was just thinking that it would be very nice if the food bank, I don't like to call it an industry because I don't think that's an appropriate term, but it'd be good if they could be as a bridge between the state and the people, because I've had a lot of experiences using the state to claim my disability benefits, and it was basically, here's your money, see you later, go and do with it what you want. And I found that very alienating, and I think the idea of being able to engage with the food bank sounds fantastic, and if they are embroiled with the state, then good, they can get things sorted out into a more stable way, because I think the problem with the state is it's not uniform across the board. I've got a sister who has exactly the same disability as me. She's very similar to me in many ways, and we got completely different benefits when we applied, and that just shows how different things are.
Thank you. So that's a bit of a theme, actually. Perhaps the state's failing, and new methods need to come in, and maybe something for Dave to think about. Were there some other extra hands, or is that everything? Right, I'll make you the last person. Oh, right, I'll take you first, and then you. So yeah.
I hope we've talked about research a bit. I hope somebody's doing some research about the actual nature of sanctions, because I know that that's a powerful reason that people are using food banks, and I'm deeply grateful on behalf of people I know that they're there. Dave, the first speaker, spoke just a little bit about them, but I think there's a lot more that we could discover about the causes.
Thank you. I'll take you, Clemens.
Yeah, just for Dave Clements, really. Leeds is one of the most unequal cities in the country statistically, and I think inequality is a really important thing for a lot of people, perhaps not all people, but when you get people who've grown up without loving parents or guardians, and they've never experienced that, they've gone to a school where it was quite chaotic, which is not the experience I have, and I'm sure you haven't had that experience, Dave. It helps me, because I've worked with an organisation called St George's Crypt for nearly 10 years. It helps me to understand how people get into this situation. That's not everyone, but I think that's really important, understanding the world we live in, which is vastly unequal. And I think the more we can understand that, the more we can actually show compassion to people who have got very complex lives.
Thank you very much, audience. Thank you for questions and points. As is the case, I'm sure, both at the Leeds Salon and at the Battle of Ideas, it's often the audience questions and interaction that really bring the debate alive. So thank you very much. I've also got a top tip for where to go to rabbits, for rabbits if I'm right, so I'm going to go in reverse order, starting with Richard. So Richard, there's obviously a lot there. Probably far too much for you to respond to in a couple of minutes or so, but have a stand.
I'll just deal with two points that somebody just made. Reuse of surplus food. There is certainly a lot of the supermarkets are using food banks or food banks, emergency food providers for that. And in my opinion, they're not paying nearly sufficient for the privilege to do so, because the emergency food model is actually subsidising the likes of Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, etc. for being able to get rid of their waste food. So I think the food bank model needs to actually wake up to that a little bit. The second point was somebody mentioned about conditionality at the end. There is a big project at the University of York at the moment, 5-year project on welfare conditionality. It is a massive issue. So I'm going to just sum up, and I will just take two little excerpts from my own research, and this just is actually to confound what Dave said. Dave said hunger is exaggerated. I could not disagree more. I'll just tell you two quotes. One was from a woman called Becky, and she said this. She goes, "It wasn't a lot, like you'd get jars of things, but nothing to use them with. So like pasta sauce without any pasta, and biscuits and things that aren't really enough for a whole meal. I remember like having food and just eating it all because you're really hungry. And then you go without for a few days sometimes." And so she was supported by Fair Share. And I think that certainly suggests she was hungry. Not starving, but she was certainly hungry. And another chap called Darren, he was an ex-offender. He'd been found not guilty after a trial and he'd been released. And he'd been waiting for 6 weeks for his benefits to be processed. He borrowed £40 from his sister to live off for 6 weeks. He was tempted to go back to crime, but he'd resisted doing so. And he said, after a few days, the hunger pains seemed to dwindle a bit. And then Someone bought me a packet of biscuits at the beginning of this week, so I've been getting through the packet of digestives for the last week now. A packet of digestives for a week. But what I would finally finish off with saying is none of this discussion actually means anything unless we go and try and change things. And I think there is probably a consensus within the room that in an ideal world, and maybe I'm wrong when I say this, that in an ideal world we don't need food banks. That in 5 years, 10 years' time, there won't be food banks. And one thing that none of us have mentioned is there is actually enshrined within the United Nations a right to food. Okay? And I think within all of this we forget that sometimes. And I certainly would argue that there needs to be a massive repoliticisation of the right to food. Because I just think it's, and I think it's shameful that in today's society, where we are reasonably affluent in this country, that people are going hungry. However many or few people that may be, one is too many for me.
Richard, thank you very much.
Okay, so if I can just touch really briefly on three things that I would have liked to have come back on. One is the idea of, we talked about community taboos and the fact that you know, that in this room you should be ashamed, you should have some shame over certain things. And I'd like to just speak about that a little bit, because I do understand from a sociological point of view the benefit to us as human beings to have a sense of taboo and a sense of shame, but not universally about things that we should not feel ashamed about. So when I was a teenager, one of my friends at school became pregnant underage and was so ashamed that she killed herself. She took an overdose of paracetamol and killed herself. And at the time, people treated that as a totally taboo subject, everything around that. And actually, I'm glad I live in a society now where that is no longer taboo in the same way, and that people do not carry unnecessary shame. And I do believe that with our help as a charity and the help of many others in this field in the UK, what was considered to be taboo, that you ever admit to being in that level of poverty, that level of need, that if we can lift that taboo forever, that would be a fantastic legacy for us as a charity. So I agree that some taboos are needed, but not all, and hunger should not be a taboo subject. We should be able to talk about that. The other thing I wanted to talk just really briefly was Paul raised the idea of why aren't the working classes rising up en masse and saying something about this if things have been so bad for so long. And I have a bit of an echo in that feeling, coming from a very working class background myself. This is what we do well. We rise up and we take arms against the ruling classes. One of the things I would just point you to is the riots that we experienced just a few summers ago. And I think that a lot of research has been done into the reasons behind that. But I do understand that some of the reasons behind that was just the experience of poverty and inequality in the UK, and obviously a few flash incidents unleashed that and so on. I think the other thing I'd point to is what is still happening in Scotland since the referendum, although it became a no vote, for which I'm very grateful, having family up there still. There is something has been unleashed in Scotland. There are demonstrations happening every weekend in city centres in Scotland at the minute. It just has not died down. Something has been awoken. And I think it is to do with poverty and to do with inequality and various other issues. So I think something is happening. It doesn't look like perhaps what it looked like when you and I were younger, but it looks like what it has to look like for today's society. And then just a very final word, and thank you, Dan, is it behind the camera? About your hint to us to really nuance a little bit this use of the word empowerment, and I do appreciate your pointing that out. That I think it's quite a blunt word to use to describe a very nuanced sort of set of circumstances. Just to say what we attempt to do in Food Bank is to not take power away from the client. I agree that not everyone needs to be empowered. They're already powerful. They're just hungry. Not everyone needs to be referred to another supportive agency. They've already got all the support they need. But we definitely don't want to set up a system where we're draining the power from people and creating a dependency. And I believe the structure that we set up minimises that disempowerment.
Anne, thank you very much. And as we started with you, Dave, we'll finish.
Okay, thank you. I'm surprised that neither of my co-panelists have mentioned Tesco or defended Tesco, or rather, Richard has mentioned Tesco, but in order to accuse it of being subsidised, and Anne, whose organisation receives a lot of money from, or a lot of help from Tesco, didn't mention them at all. As I understand it, today 53 million meals have been provided by Tesco. That's its customers, a 30% top up by Tesco itself, and then also its surplus food. Whatever you think of Tesco, that sounds like quite a lot of help to me. That's quite a good thing. Supermarkets are often portrayed as the bad guy, but clearly they're playing an important role in the food bank industry. I will call it an industry, because I think that's what it's become. Somebody in the audience mentioned food banks as potentially, or the rise of food banks potentially leading to the demolition of the welfare state. That may not be such a bad thing. Anne mentioned the riots as being a consequence of people's deprivation and poverty. I think it's pretty well documented that wasn't the case at all. What happened there was the kinds of institutions that our society has, the welfare state and this kind of interventionist relationship that certain people in certain communities have with the state, has actually created a lot of damage. It's undermined those communities to the point where some young people in particular are rioting and in their own communities and damaging the property, rebelling against the members of their own community. So to the extent that the welfare state has played a role in creating those circumstances, I don't think it's such a bad thing to actually look if we can come up with some sort of an alternative. The sort of alternative we might come up with is the sort of thing that those people who created this big society idea were initially sort of trying to get at. This idea that people can do things for themselves, they can organise themselves in their own communities, they can not have to rely on support from external organisations. That idea wasn't destroyed because societies are too complex and because neighbours don't know each other. It was destroyed by this kind of undermining of those relationships, the undermining of the informal kind of links that people have with each other. The idea that you can't trust your neighbour because you don't know what they're up to, because they're a child abuser or they're going to beat up the elderly neighbour. The idea of people supporting each other is actually frowned upon as something which we shouldn't believe anymore. We should be suspicious of them. So I would agree that the guy who said that people are more resilient than they're made out to be. I agree with that. I think the problem is that they are portrayed as incredibly vulnerable and dependent and passive. I don't think that's the truth. The danger is it becomes more and more the case as those relationships become more and more ingrained. So I don't agree that vulnerability is a strength. Vulnerability is vulnerability, and we need to encourage people to rely on their own resources and those of their communities, rather than encouraging this kind of passive relationship with food banks and with the wider welfare state.
Dave, thank you very much. Thank you to all three of our speakers for giving up their time, to Richard and Dave, but also to Anne, who obviously represents the Trussell Trust, and obviously they take both a lot of flack and have a lot of attention, so thank you very much for your time as well. Right, back to Paul, because the debate continues outside this formal setting.
Okay, well, can we have a round of applause for Justine and all our speakers again, please?